She didn't cry when he put the crown on her sister's head. She had already been crying for 3 months straight inside, in the dark, pressed against his chest in the garden, believing every word he whispered. By the time the silver circlet touched Arabella's golden hair, Gwyneth had no tears left. Just a cold, hollow quiet where her heart used to be. That was the night everything ended. And though she didn't know it yet, the night everything began. Gwyneth had never been the obvious choice for anything. Her father, the late Duke of Ethelgard, had loved her in his quiet, distracted way, but he had died when she was 9, leaving behind a legacy that belonged entirely to Arabella, pure-blooded, radiant, ferociously ambitious Arabella, who had been groomed since birth to stand at the side of the most powerful alpha in the Western territories. Gwyneth was the other one, the half-blood, the shadow daughter, tolerated because it would have been unseemly to throw her out entirely, kept because a ghost in the corner was easier to manage than a scandal. She had learned early how to make herself small, how to fold her edges inward so she took up less space, less air, less attention. She was good at it. 17 years of practice will do that to a person. Shorn had been the first man who ever looked at her like she was worth seeing. He had found her in the East Garden, 3 months before the choosing ceremony, when she had gone there to be alone with the rain. She had been sitting on the stone bench beneath the old oak, her face tipped up to the gray sky, not caring that her hair was soaked through. He had stopped at the edge of the path and stared at her like she was something he had never encountered before. Not a ghost. Not a shadow. Something real. "You're not afraid of the rain," he said. It wasn't a question. "I like the rain," she answered, which was the most honest thing she had said to anyone in months. He sat down beside her. They talked until the storm passed. He came back the next night. And the next. And the night after that. For 3 months, Gwyneth let herself believe. He whispered promises against her hair. He held her hands in the dark and told her the mate bond was sacred, that the moon goddess had chosen her for him, that he didn't care about politics or bloodlines or the restless ambitions of the high nobility. He told her she was enough. He told her she was more than enough. She believed him. She was a fool. The choosing ceremony was held in the great hall of Winterbourne Castle, the ceiling soaring above a sea of velvet and fur and polished steel. Gwyneth stood near the back in a deep crimson dress, her heart hammering against her ribs. She watched Shorn walk down the central aisle in ceremonial black leather, the silver Luna circlet in his hands. His storm-gray eyes scanned the room and found hers for exactly half a second. She saw the recognition. She saw the warmth. And then she saw the calculation, fast and cold, sliding like a blade behind his gaze. The High Elder gave a single nod toward the gathered lords on the northern side of the room. Lords whose armies Shorn needed. Lords whose loyalty could not be bought with love alone. Shorn kept walking. He stopped in front of Arabella. Gwyneth felt the mate bond, the fragile, half-formed thread that had been weaving itself between them over 3 months of secret meetings, snap like a green twig in frost. Her wolf flinched in the deep dark of her mind and went very, very quiet. She watched Arabella sink into a curtsy, watched the triumphant little smile curl at the corner of her sister's mouth, and understood in that moment something she had not allowed herself to consider before. Arabella had known. Arabella had always known. She left the hall while the crowd was still roaring its approval. She didn't run. Running would have been noticed. She walked with her chin level and her hands folded at her waist, the same way she had learned to walk through every other humiliation of her life, until she was around the corner and down the servants' corridor and out through the side gate into the cold night air. Then she just stood there, breathing. Her chamber door opened an hour later. Arabella came in still wearing the circlet, the silver against her golden hair, and the scent of Shorn's cologne thick on her skin. Gwyneth was already packing, folding her few decent dresses into a canvas bag with the focused, mechanical calm of someone who had decided to simply survive this. "Going somewhere, little sister?" Arabella's voice was smooth, pleasant, almost kind. "You have what you want," Gwyneth said, not looking up. "Let me leave." Arabella was quiet for a moment. Gwyneth could feel her watching. That particular watching Arabella had always done, that cataloging, assessing gaze that she had felt on her skin since childhood. Then Arabella said, "Good. I'm glad you have the sense to go." Gwyneth looked up then, because that was not what she had expected. Arabella was not smiling. Her expression was something more complicated. Not triumphant, not cruel, not the theatrical villainy that Gwyneth had braced herself for. Just a kind of tightly controlled certainty. The look of someone who has made a decision and intends to live with it. "He would have ruined you," Arabella said flatly. "His court is a pit of knives, and he is not a man who stays decided. You are too," She paused, and something crossed her face that Gwyneth couldn't quite read. You feel things too much. You would have been destroyed in a year. That was my choice to make, Gwyneth said. No, Arabella said. It wasn't. Not really. And then the mask came back down, smooth and golden as always, and Arabella said in her brisk, finished voice, Don't come back. If you do, I'll have the guards remove you. That's not a threat, it's practical advice. She turned at the door. Take the northern route. The eastern pass has wolves Shorn hasn't neutered yet. The door clicked shut. Gwyneth stood there for a long moment, bag half-packed, trying to understand what had just happened. It didn't fit the shape of the story she had been telling herself. The story where Arabella was the villain, simple and whole. There was something else in it, something crooked and wrong and too close to complicated for Gwyneth to look at right now. She finished packing and left. She didn't know about the pregnancy until a week later, huddled in a filthy tavern at the edge of the territory, when the nausea hit her for the fourth morning in a row and her leakened senses, sharpened by fear, finally registered the change in her own scent. Beneath the road dust and the sorrow and the cheap tallow candles of the tavern, something new. Something small and wild and stubbornly alive. Rain and pine. His scent, living now inside her. The panic came first, fast and suffocating. If Shorn found out, he might take the child and dispose of her as a liability. His court had already tried to simplify difficult situations with sharp solutions. She could not go back, and she could not stay anywhere that his reach extended. She had to go farther than far. She had to go somewhere that no one from Winterbourne would follow. Her grandmother's letters came back to her then. She had received them over the years, sporadically, written in the cramped hand of a woman who clearly thought paper was a wasteful luxury. Her grandmother, her mother's mother, who had left the lowlands before Gwyneth was born and gone north. Far north. To the ice territories where her grandmother had built something of her own, something that belonged to no king and owed fealty to no crown. Gwyneth had always thought those letters were a kind of fairy story, an old woman exaggerating her independence, embroidering her solitude into legend. She pulled the latest letter from the bottom of her bag. Read it again in the tavern's dim light. Come if you need to, the last line said. The door is never locked for you. She started north the next morning. The crossing of the jagged peaks should have killed her. It almost did, twice. The mountains were brutal in midwinter, the paths half buried in snow, the cold a physical weight that pressed down on her chest and made each step a negotiation with her own body. Her wolf was weakened. The severed half-bond had left a wound that bled energy she could not spare. But the small, insistent spark of life in her womb was a strange kind of compass. It kept orienting her. Forward. Keep going. Not yet. She ate frozen roots and melted snow and, on one desperate afternoon, the remains of something a mountain hawk had abandoned. She lost feeling in two toes for 3 days and spent an hour in a crevice of rock while a mountain lion paced outside, deciding whether she was worth the effort. Eventually it decided she wasn't. She emerged on the northern slopes 23 days after she had entered the mountains, ragged and half-starved and more alive than she had ever been. The ice territories were not what she had expected. She had pictured desolation, a wasteland of snow and silence, presided over by a stubborn old woman with a small band of desperate followers. Instead, the settlement she found, after 2 more days of following a frozen river north, was a proper stronghold. Stone walls, thick and well-built, rising above the tree line. Torchlight in the windows. The sound of voices, multiple voices, the layered sound of an actual community. And at the gate, 2 female guards in furred armor who looked at her with sharp, assessing eyes and no particular intimidation. Who are you? The taller one asked. Gwyneth of Ethelgard, Gwyneth said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. I am Myra's granddaughter. She said the door was never locked. The guards exchanged a look. Then the tall one said, Wait here, and disappeared inside. She was back in 5 minutes. Come. The woman who came to meet her in the great hall of Frostholm was not what Gwyneth had pictured either. She had expected frailty, perhaps. Age. A diminished version of the mythologized grandmother of the letters. Mira was 73 years old, and built like a woman who had spent those years deciding exactly who she was, and had liked the answer. She was tall, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, with the deliberate posture of someone who had never once in her adult life felt the need to make herself smaller. Her eyes, dark and quick and warm, took Gwyneth in from head to boots with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to assessing situations fast. You look terrible, Mira said. I've had a difficult few weeks, Gwyneth said. Clearly. Myra's gaze dropped briefly to Gwyneth's midsection. Something shifted in her expression. How far along? 8 weeks, I think. Maybe 9. Sit down before you fall down. We'll talk after you've eaten. They did talk later, with Gwyneth wrapped in 2 wool blankets and holding a bowl of thick soup that tasted like the finest thing she had ever consumed. She told her grandmother most of it: the garden meetings, the ceremony, the choosing, the pregnancy. She did not name the father. Her grandmother did not ask. "You'll stay," Mira said. It was not a question. "If you'll have me. I told you the door was never locked." Mira refilled her soup bowl without asking. "Frostholm is yours as much as mine. Your mother was my daughter. That makes you mine." Gwyneth pressed her lips together hard. She had not cried since the night of the choosing ceremony. She did not cry now, but it was close. "What is this place?" she asked when she trusted her voice. "Really? Your letters never quite." "It's a pack," Mira said simply. "My pack. Built over 40 years with women who needed somewhere to go and men who understood that power shared is power multiplied." She set down her cup. "We don't answer to any king. We don't pay tribute to any alpha. Our laws are ours. The Southern courts would say that's impossible. The Southern courts can say whatever they like from 1,000 miles away." Myra's eyes glinted. "They haven't tried us." Gwyneth stayed. The months that followed were the hardest and also, strangely, some of the most clarifying of her life. Frostholm did not indulge fragility, but it was not cruel about it. The women here were practical, self-sufficient, matter-of-fact about difficulty in a way that stripped away the drama Gwyneth had learned to wrap around her own suffering. Here, problems were just problems. You assessed them, you addressed them, you moved on. She learned to do things she had never done. She learned to mend armor. She learned the medicinal properties of the northern plants that grew in the shadow of the ice. She learned to track in the snow, to read weather, to negotiate supply trades with the nomadic clans that passed through Frostholm's territory twice yearly. Her wolf, starved and wounded for months, slowly recovered in the cold, clean air, growing stronger in ways that surprised even Gwyneth. Her grandmother watched all of this with quiet satisfaction and occasionally useful commentary. "Stop apologizing before you speak," she told Gwyneth one afternoon, about 4 months in. "You do it every time. You begin every sentence with an apology for the sentence." "Stop." "I don't," Gwyneth started, then stopped. "Thought about it." "I do." "Yes." "Stop." It took her another month to stop. The birth, when it came, was hard. 6 hours of labor in the cold stone room that Myra's healer had prepared, with 2 midwives and her grandmother present, and a blizzard howling outside the walls. Gwyneth had prepared herself for this moment with the same methodical grimness she had applied to everything else over the past months. But nothing prepared her, exactly, for the moment the crying started. High and fierce and absolutely certain of its own existence. "A girl," the senior midwife said, placing the swaddled bundle in Gwyneth's arms. Gwyneth looked down. The baby had raven hair and enormous dark eyes and a stubborn set to her tiny jaw that was entirely her own. No storm gray in her gaze, no echo of Winterbourne's great hall. Just herself, completely. Already furious. Already here. "Hello," Gwyneth said quietly, to this small, furious person she had carried through mountains and across tundra and into a new world entirely. The baby stopped crying, looked at her, decided she was acceptable. Gwyneth named her Ren. The recovery was harder than anyone warned her it would be. 3 weeks of being confined to her room, which she found humiliating. A month before she could move without pain. The leaken healing that had always felt like a superpower seemed to move at half speed, the birth having cost her something she couldn't quite measure. Myra's healer, a no-nonsense woman named Petra, told her plainly that her body had endured a great deal over the past year and that there would be lasting effects. "What kind of effects?" Gwyneth asked. Petra looked at her steadily. "Another pregnancy would be very difficult. Possibly dangerous. I would not recommend it." Gwyneth absorbed this. She thought she should feel more about it, grief, perhaps, or the particular anguish the Southern court etiquette books associated with a woman's failure to produce abundantly. But what she actually felt was something closer to relief, which she examined carefully and decided she was not ashamed of. Ren was enough. Ren was more than enough. The thought of going through what the last year had put her body through, and doing it again, made her feel tired in a way she couldn't put into words. She told Petra, "Note that in whatever records you keep. I won't be trying again." Petra nodded once, without judgment, and that was the end of it. It was 6 weeks after Ren's birth that he arrived. Gwyneth heard the commotion from her chamber before she saw anything. Voices in the courtyard, the clink of armor, the particular charge in the air that preceded the arrival of someone significant. She wrapped Ren against her chest in the first sling Mira had made and went to the window. The man riding through Frostholm's gates was not part of any delegation she recognized. He came with a small company, 8 riders, all of them quiet and purposeful, none wearing the livery of any court she knew. The man at the front rode a black horse that moved with the coiled, deliberate power of its rider, both of them seemingly unbothered by the cold, or the terrain, or the armed Frostholm sentries who had materialized at the walls. He was tall enough to be noticeable even mounted. Dark hair, the northern wind pulling it across a jaw that was all clean lines and controlled strength. He carried himself with the particular quality of an alpha who had earned his authority rather than inherited it. Not the loud, territorial aggression of Shorn and his court, but something quieter and more absolute. The kind of power that doesn't need to announce itself, because it simply is. Gwyneth pulled back from the window slightly. Her wolf stirred, which was unexpected. Her grandmother's voice came from the corridor outside. "Gwyneth, come down. There's someone you should meet." She found Mira in the great hall with the stranger, who was standing with his hands open at his sides in the universal gesture of peaceful intent. Up close, he was even more striking, mid-30s she guessed, with dark eyes that moved through the room with a systematic intelligence that catalogued and assessed without seeming to pry. When those eyes landed on her, they paused. Not with the predatory assessment she had grown accustomed to from the men of Shorn's court. Something different. Something that looked, for just a moment, like recognition, although they had never met. "Gwyneth," Mira said, "this is Calder. He and I have been in correspondence for some time. He has a proposal." "For the settlement?" Gwyneth asked. "For you," Mira said, with the directness she applied to everything. "Among other things. Sit. Both of you. And someone bring tea. It's freezing and I'm not young." Calder sat. He waited until Gwyneth was seated before he took his own chair, which she noticed. Then he said, without preamble, "You're Shorn's mate." It was not a question. Not quite an accusation either. Just a fact being named. "Former," Gwyneth said. The bond was severed. He made another choice. "I know what he chose." Something shifted in Calder's jaw. "I know Shorn of Winterborn rather better than he knows me." "Who are you?" Calder was quiet for a moment. Then, in the same flat, factual tone, his father's firstborn son. Different mother. A merchant woman who was apparently not suitable material for a royal consort. A pause. "I was sent away before I was born, technically. My mother was escorted out of the territory while she was still carrying me. Paid off. Told to disappear." Gwyneth looked at him carefully. "And you built something instead." "A territory," Calder said. "Northeast of the ice ridge. Small currently, but solid. And growing." He looked at her steadily. "I have been planning for 12 years to take back what was taken from me. Not the title. I have no interest in sitting on Shorn's throne. But there are resources, treaty rights, trade agreements that his father stole when he stole my birthright. I want those back. And I want his hold on the northern routes broken, because it's strangling every independent settlement north of the peaks, including Frostholm." Gwyneth looked at her grandmother. Mira raised an eyebrow in an expression that communicated, "I told you he was interesting," without saying a word. "What does this have to do with me?" Gwyneth asked. "You know Winterborn's court," Calder said. "Its politics, its fault lines, which lords are genuinely loyal and which are simply afraid. You were inside it for long enough to understand how it works. I've been trying to understand it from the outside for 12 years. He paused. "Also," he said, and something in his voice changed slightly, "you are the mother of Shorn's child. His only living heir, if the reports I've received about Arabella's marriage are accurate." Gwyneth felt the air in the room change. "Don't," she said, the word coming out quiet but absolute. Calder shook his head immediately. "I'm not asking to use your daughter. I'm telling you that you have standing that you may not have considered yet. Political standing. The kind that can be built into something." "Into what?" Calder looked at her for a long moment, and she had the sense that he was choosing his words carefully. Not to manipulate, but because he was someone who meant what he said, and therefore said things that meant something. "Into a throne of your own," he said. "Not Shorn's. Not mine. Yours." The silence that followed lasted long enough for Ren to make a small, imperious sound against Gwyneth's chest and be soothed back to sleep. "Tell me," Gwyneth said finally, "what you have in mind." They talked for 4 hours. Over the following weeks, they talked for many hours more. Calder was not what Gwyneth had expected from anyone who shared blood with Shorn, although the resemblance was there. The height, the broad-shouldered build, the storm that lived in his eyes. But where Shorn's storms were theatrical, full of performance and calculation, Calder's was internal. He was a man who kept his weather to himself, and only showed you what he chose. He was patient in argument in a way that Gwyneth found genuinely disarming. He didn't talk over her. He didn't summarize her points back to her with the subtle modifications men use to make their own versions sound better. When she disagreed with his strategy, he listened, actually listened, with the stillness of someone who was genuinely interested in what she was going to say next. And he changed his mind when she made a good case, and said so directly. It was so startling the first time it happened that she stared at him. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Then, you agreed with me. Your point was correct. Most men in your position would have found a way to explain why they'd thought of it first." Calder looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, a slight tightening at the corner of his mouth that meant he found something genuinely funny but was not going to perform it. "I find that kind of thing tiring," he said, "and counterproductive. You're going to be the sharpest person in most rooms, Gwyneth. It would be spectacularly stupid of me to waste that." She told herself the warmth she felt at that was simply professional respect. She wasn't entirely convincing. Calder stayed at Frost home through the winter. His presence had a way of reshaping the landscape of a room, not by demanding space, but simply by being someone that other people oriented toward, like North. Gwyneth's grandmother watched him with the thoughtful, almost amused expression of someone watching a story develop that they had suspected the shape of some time ago. "Don't give me that look," Gwyneth told her one evening. "I'm not giving you any look," Mira said innocently, which was an outright lie. The thing that undid her, in the end, was not the strategy sessions or the long conversations about territorial politics, or even the particular quality of his attention when she spoke. It was something smaller than that. Wren was 3 months old, squirmy and vocal, and entirely ruling the household with approximately 12 pounds of absolute tyranny. Gwyneth was in the great hall going over supply lists, Wren in the sling at her chest, when the baby began to cry with the particular sustained fury that meant she was done being carried and wanted to be set down on a surface where she could practice being furious in a larger space. Gwyneth set her down on the wide low table, keeping one hand on her, and tried to continue reading with the other. Wren immediately grabbed the edge of the supply list and began systematically destroying it. "May I?" Calder said from across the table. Gwyneth looked up. He was already reaching out, his large hands settling with careful, unhurried gentleness around Wren's small ribs, lifting her and settling her against his chest with the practiced ease of someone who had clearly spent time around infants. Wren, in the way of very small people who operate on pure instinct, grabbed a fistful of his collar and regarded him with enormous suspicious eyes. Calder regarded her back, with exactly the same degree of gravity. After approximately 15 seconds, Wren decided this was acceptable and began attempting to eat his collar. "Thank you," Gwyneth said. "She's been opinionated," Calder said. "I was going to say demanding. They're the same trait. It'll serve her well later." Gwyneth looked at him, this large, serious, self-contained man standing in her grandmother's great hall holding her daughter like it was the most natural thing in the world, speaking of Wren's future with the offhand certainty of someone who simply assumed she had won. She felt something shift in her chest that she recognized, this time, with considerably less self-deception than she had brought to the garden meetings in Winterbourne 3 years ago. This was different, though. This was not the giddy, desperate hoping of someone who had been starved of being seen. This was something slower, something she was actually examining as it arrived, rather than just drowning in. Still, she noticed it. It was the following week that he did the thing with her abdomen, and she had to revise everything she thought she understood about what she was feeling. She had been struggling with pain. Petra had warned her that the recovery would be nonlinear, that there would be difficult days even months out. That afternoon was a difficult one, a deep, persistent ache low in her belly, the kind that came without warning and made her sit down until it passed. She was on the bench by the fire in the small receiving room when Calder found her, his face doing something careful and controlled as he registered what was happening. "Sit," she said before he could suggest it. "I'm fine. It passes." He sat across from her, said nothing for a while. Then, quietly, "Does it happen often?" "Less than it did. Petra says it'll improve." He nodded. Another silence. Then he said, "Can I?" and stopped. She looked at him curiously. He looked down, then back at her, and it was the first time she had seen him uncertain about anything. "Would it be acceptable," he said carefully, "if I sat with you? Closer than this?" She studied him for a moment. Then she moved over on the bench. He sat beside her. He didn't touch her, just his presence, the warmth of him, which was considerable. Then he looked at her abdomen, at the way she was holding her hands against herself, and said, May I? She wasn't sure what she expected. But he placed his hand against her stomach very gently over her hands and just held, his palm warm through the fabric. Not pressing, just there. After a moment, the pain eased. She didn't know if it was the warmth or the simple presence of another person choosing to stay. It didn't entirely matter. Calder, she said. Why are you actually here? At Frost Home. The political reasons I understand. But you stayed through the winter. You could have sent a representative. A pause. I could have, he said. So why didn't you? He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said in the same level, deliberate voice he used when he was saying something that cost him. Because I read about you. Before I came, my intelligence on Winterbourne's court included reports about you, going back years. About a half-blood girl who was treated as furniture and who had the sense to survive anyway. And then the crossing of the peaks alone in winter while pregnant. He paused. And I thought, whoever this woman is, I wanted to meet her. And now that you have. He looked at her sideways. The warmth in his eyes was not performed. It was just there, steady and unhurried, like everything else about him. Now I want to be whatever is useful to her, he said. For as long as she'll allow it. Outside, the ice wind screamed against the stone walls. Inside, everything was very warm and very still. You know, Gwyneth said. That's the most romantic thing anyone has ever said to me, and it didn't even contain a compliment. I have compliments, Calder said. I have several. I've been saving them. Saving them for what? For when they'd be worth something. When you'd hear them as fact rather than flattery. He looked at her steadily. You're the most formidably intelligent person I've met in 12 years of planning a fairly complicated political operation. You have a strategic mind that most people would spend a lifetime trying to develop, and you arrived at it by surviving things that would have ended most. And the way you talk about Ren's future, he stopped. Started again. You speak about her like she's already who she's going to become. Like you can see it. That's not something many parents have. Gwyneth looked at the fire for a long moment. You've been saving those for a while. Months, he confirmed. Were there more? A pause. Then, and she could hear the restraint in it, several. But I don't want to overwhelm you. She laughed. It came out surprised. A real laugh, not the polite version she had been performing for years. She felt it in her chest, bright and unguarded, and she did not try to put it away. It became a habit, after that, the evenings by the fire. Talking strategy by day, sitting in the quieter, warmer register of something neither of them named, but both of them were clearly living inside. He found reasons to be nearby when the pain hit. Not hovering, he was not a hoverer, but present. A hand against her back as she stood. His palm against her stomach, just warm, just steady, while she breathed through the hard moments. Once, sitting like that in the receiving room, his head dropped forward until his temple was resting against her midsection. Just resting. Ren asleep in her arms, the fire low, the rest of Frostholm quiet beyond the walls. His hand moved slowly over the place where the silver lines of the birth marked her skin, the faint roadmap of what her body had done and paid for. He said very quietly, I want you to know that I will never ask you for another child. This is not a negotiation or a caveat. It is simply what I'm telling you. She looked down at the top of his dark head. At his hand, careful and reverent on the geography of what she had endured. Petra told me it would be dangerous, she said. I know. She told me too. I asked her permission before I told you. Gwyneth blinked. You asked Petra's permission to tell me this? It seemed like information she should know I had, before I said it to you. He tilted his head up and looked at her, and his eyes were entirely unguarded, which she was beginning to understand was his version of saying everything. You went through something I cannot imagine, Gwyneth. Ren is here. She is extraordinary and she is enough and she will always be enough. And the subject of more children is closed unless you ever choose to open it yourself. Which you won't need to. She was quiet for a long time. Ren stirred in her arms, sighed, went still again. You're very sure, Gwyneth said finally. About this, yes. About a lot of things. The things that matter, yes. He held her gaze. Less sure than I appear about some of the things I'd most like to be certain of. She understood what he meant. She let it sit between them for now, warm and unhurried, because this was something she was choosing with both eyes open this time, and it did not need to be rushed. She pressed her hand lightly over his where it rested against her stomach. He turned his palm up and held it. That was, in its quiet and particular way, a beginning. Spring came late to the ice territories, but it came. The days lengthened and the ice cracked and ran and Frostholm shifted into a different rhythm, the industry of the settlement turning outward after the winter's necessary inwardness. Gwyneth was on her feet fully now, Wren strapped to her back or handed off to her grandmother, or to any of the Frostholm women who had developed a complicated devotion to the baby over the past months. She was also increasingly in rooms with maps. Calder had laid out his strategy over the winter in broad strokes. Over the following weeks, Gwyneth had taken those strokes and turned them into something with teeth. She understood Winterbourne's court in a way he couldn't from the outside, knew which elder lords were genuinely ideologically committed and which were simply waiting for the wind to change, knew the particular pressure points that Shorn's administration had always tried to ignore, knew where the fractures were in the alliance structure that held the Western territories together. The northern trade routes are the key, she told Calder, leaning over the map with a stylus. Not the border forts. Everyone focuses on the forts because they're visible, but the routes are where the actual power lives. If you can establish treaty rights with the 3 nomadic clans that control the ridge passes, Shorn's ability to tax northern trade collapses. Calder followed her stylus. We've tried the Varric clan before. They won't negotiate. They wouldn't negotiate with you because you came as an alpha making territorial claims. They're not interested in alpha territorial politics. Their model is mercantile. She tapped the map. You need to send a trading delegation, not a diplomatic one. And it can't be led by you. He raised an eyebrow. It needs to be led by a woman, Gwyneth said. Specifically, ideally my grandmother. The Varric clan's high elder is Myra's contemporary. They have history. Calder was quiet for a moment. I didn't know that. I do, Gwyneth said. Because I've been talking to my grandmother. She straightened up. Myra is not just a useful ally for her territory. She is a 40-year archive of relationships and leverage across the entire northern region. You've been treating Frostholm as a base. You should be treating it as a vault. He looked at her for a long moment. Then, yes, he said simply. Yes, what? Yes, you're right. What else? She told him what else. He listened. He took notes in his cramped, efficient handwriting. He asked questions that sharpened her thinking rather than deflecting it. When she made errors, and she did twice, missing pieces of context he had that she lacked, he corrected her without the particular relish that correction usually seemed to give men in positions of authority. They built something over those weeks. A plan, yes, and more than a plan. A trust that had been constructed piece by piece through every conversation where he hadn't talked over her, every decision where he'd included her because her input was genuinely material and not decorative, every moment by the fire that had no political content whatsoever, and was simply 2 people choosing to be in the same place. Myra watched all of this with the expression of a woman who had been correct about something for some time and was choosing not to say I told you so because she was above that. Mostly. He's a good man, she told Gwyneth one afternoon, the 2 of them walking the settlement's perimeter in the thin spring sunshine, Wren riding on Myra's back with the proprietary ease of someone who had decided this was simply her designated mountain. He's a complicated man, Gwyneth said. Those aren't mutually exclusive. Myra glanced at her sideways. You know what the difference is between him and Shorn? Several things, Gwyneth said. The important one. Shorn wanted a woman who made him look like what he wanted to be. Calder wants a woman who makes him think about things he hadn't considered. Myra shrugged. One of those is love. The other is furniture. You've been furniture before. It doesn't suit you. Gwyneth walked in silence for a moment. You're very wise, she said finally. I'm old, Myra said. It's not the same thing, but it rhymes. The message from Winterbourne arrived in midsummer. It came via a traveling merchant who had taken 3 different routes to bring it, obscuring its origin, but the seal on the inner envelope was unmistakable. A letter from within Shorn's court. From, of all people, a low-ranking record-keeper named Essa, who identified herself as having once shared a dormitory with Gwyneth during the 3 months Gwyneth had lived in Winterbourne. Gwyneth read the letter twice before she showed it to Calder. Things were bad in Winterbourne. The harvests had failed for the 3rd consecutive year. The common wolf population was restless in a way that was tipping toward open unrest. Shorn's authority was holding, but barely. The lords who had backed his choice of Arabella were increasingly vocal about their dissatisfaction, because the currency they had expected in return for that backing, stability and fertility, and the continued expansion of the Western trade network had not materialized. Arabella was a separate disaster. She had become, in Essa's careful, understated language, difficult to manage. She ruled by fear now, surrounded by informants and enforcers, executing perceived slights with a speed and violence that had the pack walking on glass. Essa wrote that the Luna was in the Great Hall nearly every hour, issuing edicts and revising them and issuing new ones, a restless, frantic energy that everyone around her read as desperation. And Shorn had begun drinking heavily and delegating increasingly large portions of governance to a council of elders who were, in S's estimation, not acting in the pack's best interests. The information was valuable. It was also, Gwyneth noted when she put the letter down, a little sad. Not for Shorn, she had moved through that grief and out the other side. But for Winterbourne itself, which was just a place where people lived, common wolves who had done nothing wrong and were now paying for choices their king had made. "We don't need to wait as long as I thought," she told Calder. He read the letter. "The Lord factions that backed Arabella's installation," he said. "If the Varick trade rights come through, they have a reason to shift allegiance," Gwyneth said. "Yes, and the timing would give us the moral weight of acting in response to demonstrated failure, rather than appearing simply acquisitive." Calder set the letter down and looked at her across the map table. "What do you want from this, Gwyneth?" he asked. "Really? Not strategically. What do you actually want at the end of it?" She thought about that seriously because it deserved a serious answer. "I want Wren to have a world where she doesn't have to make herself smaller to survive in it," she said at last. "I want her to grow up knowing that power can be something you build rather than something you inherit, and that it can be used well." She paused. "I want something that functions, not vengeance, something that works." "And Shorn? He made his choices," Gwyneth said. "I made mine. I'd like to make sure neither of us can damage the other anymore, and then I'd like to not think about him." Calder nodded slowly. "And Arabella?" Gwyneth was quiet for a moment. The thing about Arabella was that she had never been quite simple enough to be the villain Gwyneth had needed her to be. Even from the very beginning. Even in that room, the night of the choosing ceremony, with Shorn's scent on her and the circlet on her head, there had been that moment. You would have been destroyed in a year. The certainty of it. The way Arabella had said it, not like a taunt, but like a fact she was living with. Gwyneth had spent 2.5 years in Frostholm thinking about that moment. Intermittently, the way you return to a sentence in a book that doesn't quite mean what you first thought it meant. She had also spent 2.5 years tracking, through S's letters and other channels, the patterns of what Arabella did and didn't do in Winterbourne. And there was a pattern if you looked for it. Arabella avoided Shorn. Consistently, elaborately, with the creativity of someone expending real effort. She was almost never in the same room with him when it wasn't publicly required. She had no counsel, no confidants, no personal relationships within the court. Every interaction was transactional. She had built a court that circled her like satellites, and she was alone in the middle of it. There were also, scattered through S's careful observations, small notes. The Luna knew there was a spy in the court. She had made no move to find them. She had once been seen near the records room where Essa worked, and had looked directly at her for a long moment, and then walked away without saying anything. Gwyneth did not know what to do with any of this. She had put it away for now, in the part of herself where she kept things she hadn't yet decided how to feel about. "Arabella is a problem I'll address when I'm standing in front of it," she said finally. Calder accepted this without pressing. He was good at that. The plan that Gwyneth and Calder built over the summer and into the early autumn was not the dramatic, war-first operation that Calder had originally envisioned when he had begun his 12 years of planning. It was more surgical than that, more patient. The Varick Treaty came through in early summer, Mira and the Varick High Elder negotiating over 3 days with the efficient speed of people who had known each other for decades and were finally resolving something long outstanding. The trade route access shifted. 3 of Shorn's northern lords, who had been watching the changes in the trade landscape with increasing anxiety, sent quiet inquiries. Gwyneth answered those inquiries personally. She knew these men, or had known their counterparts, the type, the calculus of their interests. She wrote letters that were precise and honest about what she was offering. Stability, actual stability, the kind that came from a functional pack structure rather than the increasingly erratic management of a failing court. The lords shifted their allegiances with the quiet efficiency of people who had been waiting for permission. Calder's 12-year plan, refined by one winter and spring and summer of Gwyneth's input, moved 3 times as fast as his original projection. In early autumn, Calder rode south with a company of 40, his northeastern territories guard supplemented by a contingent of Frostholm's armed women. Gwyneth rode beside him. Mira stayed in Frostholm with Wren for practical and political reasons, and also because Gwyneth had said goodbye at the gate and Wren had grabbed her face with both hands and looked at her with the serious, searching expression she had been deploying since birth, and Gwyneth had been obliged to breathe through something large and stay in motion. "She'll be fine," Calder said, riding beside her. "I know," Gwyneth said. "I'm fine. You don't have to be fine." I know that too. She looked forward at the long road south. I'm choosing to be fine. There's a difference. He understood the difference. One of the things she had come to appreciate most about him. The approach to Winterbourne was nothing like the dramatic march she had imagined in her angrier moments over the years. No battle. No siege. The lords who had shifted allegiance had done their work quietly, and by the time Calder's company arrived at the outer edge of Winterbourne territory, the gate delegation was already waiting. 12 men in the livery of the consolidated northern lords, offering formal passage. Gwyneth rode through those gates with her back straight, and her chin level and her face calm. The castle courtyard was thick with wolves who had come to watch. Common pack members, servants, guards, all of them staring with the complicated expressions of people who have been waiting for something to happen and are not yet sure what to feel now that it has. She had been afraid, before arriving, that coming back here would undo something in her. That the stones of Winterbourne would still have the power to make her feel the way she had felt the night of the choosing ceremony. Small, erased, not enough. They didn't. They were just stones. The courtyard was just a courtyard. She had crossed the jagged peaks in winter while pregnant, and survived, and built something in the ice, and grown a person who grabbed faces with both hands. What power could these walls possibly have over her now? She dismounted in the center of the courtyard, and the crowd was very still. Shorn came out of the great hall to meet them. He was thinner than she remembered and older, and there was something in his bearing that had changed. The absolute authority posture had become something more effortful, as though he was now holding it in place rather than simply embodying it. His storm-gray eyes moved over Calder's company, registered Calder himself with the particular tension of someone encountering something they are trying to categorize, and then landed on Gwyneth. He went very still. She looked at him. She waited for something, rage, grief, the reopening of the old wound that had sent her into the mountains. What she felt instead was something quieter, a kind of recognition and a kind of completion. The close of a long sentence. "Gwyneth," he said. "Shorn," she said. A pause. "You look well," he said, which was clearly not what he had intended to say. "I am well," she said simply. Behind him, the doors of the great hall opened, and Arabella appeared at the top of the stone steps. She looked, not as Gwyneth had expected. The Arabella she had been imagining, the paranoid, deteriorating figure of S's letters, had been superimposed in her mind over the polished, triumphant Arabella of the choosing ceremony, and what she had constructed was a villain fully formed. What she actually saw was a woman standing at the top of the steps with her golden hair perfect, and her posture impeccable, and her expression doing something extremely controlled and entirely unreadable. Arabella's eyes moved past Shorn, past Calder, past the assembled company, and found Gwyneth immediately. They stayed there. Gwyneth looked back at her. Arabella looked older, more tired than the effort she was making to look otherwise could quite conceal. And beneath the control, something that Gwyneth could not name, something that pulled at the thing she had been putting away in the undecided part of herself for 2.5 years. The confrontation in the great hall, when it happened, was not theatrical. Gwyneth had thought it might be, had half-braced for screaming, for drawn weapons, for the dramatic apparatchiks of a court in crisis. What she got instead was Shorn looking at his council of northern lords and recognizing, in the specific quality of their expressions, that the arithmetic had shifted past the point of recovery. The lords were not his anymore. The trade routes were not his. The plan that had been built over one winter and a summer in the ice had arrived here fully formed, and there was no version of the next 20 minutes where Shorn's position was recoverable. He knew it. She could see him knowing it. To his credit, he did not make it uglier than it had to be. He called the council himself. He stood in front of the gathered elders and lords and said, in a voice that was flatter and quieter than his public voice had ever been, that in light of the shifting alliances and the proposed restructuring of the northern territories, he was prepared to negotiate the terms of his relinquishment. The formal proceedings took most of the afternoon. Gwyneth sat at the council table and said very little, letting Calder's delegation speak, letting the lords articulate the terms they had already agreed to in their correspondence. Her role right now was simply to be present, visible, the specific weight of what she represented. The true mate, the living heir, the woman who had crossed the peaks and come back, grounding the proceedings in something the wolves in this room could feel in their bones. Toward the end of the afternoon, Shorn looked at her across the table. Just looked. His wolf was very quiet. She could feel it. The calculation that had always sat behind his eyes was, for this moment, absent. "She told you I called you a distraction," he said. "Yes. I never said it." "I know," Gwyneth said. She had known for some time. It didn't change the essential fact of what he had done, which was choose, but it changed the geography of it slightly. It doesn't matter now. He looked at her for a long moment. I'm sorry, he said, and it sounded like something that cost him, which she chose to acknowledge because it was real even if it was no longer relevant to her life. I know, she said again. Make your terms with the council. Then go. He went back to the table. The terms were finalized. The Western Reaches would pass to a consolidated council governance, with Calder's Northeastern Territory formally recognized as an independent authority with treaty rights across the northern routes. Gwyneth was acknowledged in the formal record as the rightful holder of her daughter Wren's inheritance claims, which were substantial. When it was over and the chamber was beginning to clear, Shorn rose. He paused beside her chair. He said very quietly, "She is healthy? Your daughter?" Gwyneth looked up at him. She thought about Wren's face in the morning, round and serious, grabbing at everything within reach. Wren's laugh, which sounded like small bells being shaken by someone furiously insistent on being joyful. Very, Gwyneth said. Shorn nodded once. Then he walked out. Arabella was still in the castle. This was the conversation Gwyneth had been having with herself for weeks, the shape of what she was going to say, whether she was going to say anything at all, whether she owed it to herself to be coldly distant, or whether that was just the performance of a grudge she was no longer sure she fully felt. She found her sister in the garden. Not the garden where Shorn had made his promises. The east garden, the one with the old oak where Gwyneth had sat in the rain the night they first met. Arabella was standing near the stone bench with her back to the gate, looking at the oak tree. Gwyneth stopped at the gate. Arabella. Arabella turned. Her expression, for just a moment before the control reasserted itself, was something that Gwyneth could not quite read even now, complicated and tired and something else. You came back, Arabella said. I did. With an army. 40 riders and the Frostholm contingent. It's not an army. Arabella looked at her. It was enough, she said. Yes. A silence. The wind moved through the oak tree. Arabella looked away, then back. The night you left, Arabella said. I told you to take the northern route. I remember. The eastern pass had a rogue den 3 miles in. 5 males, aggressive, territorial. You would have been. Arabella stopped. Started again. You were pregnant, even if I didn't know it then. Gwyneth was very still. You told me to take the northern route, she said carefully, because you knew the eastern pass was dangerous. Arabella's jaw was very tight. You were always too trusting of the wrong routes, she said, which was not quite an answer but was clearly the most she was going to give. Gwyneth looked at her sister for a long, quiet moment. At the elaborate, exhausting, crooked edifice of a person who had spent her entire life competing with, controlling, and apparently also, in her specific Arabella way, protecting the person she competed with and controlled. A person who had maneuvered her out of a dangerous situation by making it look like a threat, who had apparently had spies tracking her movements for years, and who had, if S's observations were correct, known exactly where that spy's letters were going and chosen not to stop them. She thought about rage. She had been carrying it for years, and it was familiar, and part of her wanted to hold on to it because it was clean, uncomplicated, easier to live inside than this. But she was very tired, and she had crossed the peaks and built a life in the ice and come back, and somewhere along the way the rage had become simply exhaustion. Arabella, she said. What? I'm not going to forgive you today. Arabella said nothing. I'm also not going to, Gwyneth stopped. I don't know what you are to me right now. Something complicated that I haven't finished thinking about. But I'm done being angry at you in a way that takes up room. She paused. That's all I have for you right now. Arabella was looking at the oak tree again. Her profile was impeccable, every line controlled. But her hands, clasped in front of her, were pressing against each other hard enough to whiten the knuckles. Your daughter, Arabella said. What is her name? Wren. A pause. Something crossed Arabella's face, quick and gone. It's a good name, she said flatly. Gwyneth looked at her for another moment. Then she said, Take care of yourself, Arabella, and turned to go. Gwyneth. Arabella's voice stopped her at the gate, still facing away. The man you came with. Calder. Yes. He looks at you the way. Arabella stopped. Don't let him. Gwyneth frowned slightly. Don't let him what? Don't let him stop looking at you like that, Arabella said, stiffly, like each word was being extracted under protest. People like you deserve that. They usually don't get it. Gwyneth stood at the gate for a moment, not turning around. Goodbye, Arabella, she said quietly. She walked back into the castle. She found Shorn in the outer courtyard, preparing to depart with a small personal guard. His larger complement had already dispersed. He was, she noted, leaving without drama, which was perhaps his one grace in all of this. He caught her eye as she crossed the courtyard and stopped. She walked toward him. She thought, crossing that distance, about what she wanted to say. What was proportionate? What was honest? She thought about 3 months in the dark garden and the mate bond forming, and the moment he had kept walking in the great hall, and the years of kitchen drudgery at Ethelgard, and the crossing of the peaks and Wren's first breath. She stopped in front of him. He was watching her warily, braced for whatever was coming. She hit him once, open-handed, across the face. Not with her claws and not with all her strength. Not a blow meant to damage, just one meant to land, clearly with intention. The crack of it echoed off the courtyard stones. Shorn absorbed it without flinching. His head turned with the impact, and he held it there for a moment before looking back at her. She had his full attention. That, she said calmly, is for choosing power over your mate when your mate was real, and what you had was worth keeping. Everything else, I'm done spending energy on. She met his eyes. Don't come back here. Don't try to find Wren until she's old enough to make that choice herself. If you can be someone worth knowing by then, she'll know how to reach you. Shorn's throat moved. Is that a possibility? It's a conditional one, Gwyneth said. Conditioned entirely on who you choose to be in the years ahead of you, which is, for the first time in your life, entirely up to you. She stepped back. Good luck, Shorn. She walked away. She heard him ride out. She didn't watch. The restructuring of the council took 3 more days. Gwyneth spent most of it in the records rooms with Calder and the lead administrator of the new joint council, a sharp-eyed woman named Hessa, who had been one of Elder Jonathan's protégés and who had, it turned out, been quietly appalled by the court's dysfunction for the past 3 years and was intensely grateful to have something functional to build instead. At night, she and Calder sat in the great hall long after the rest of the delegates had gone to sleep, the fire burning low, and talked through what came next. Not the immediate logistics, those were handled, but the larger question of what they were building and why. Frostholm is my home, Gwyneth said. My grandmother built it, and I've been part of it for 2 years and I know it. That's my territory to inherit. Yes, Calder said. And you have yours in the northeast. The restructured northern route rights formalize that. Yes. 2 territories, Gwyneth said, with a treaty between them that's built on something more substantive than political convenience. Yes, Calder said, watching her. And Wren has a claim here, which the council will administer in trust until she's of age. Correctly handled, Calder said. So what I'm saying, Gwyneth said, is that we are both, in practical terms, building something independent. 2 separate and functioning territories, governed by 2 people who have chosen to operate as equals. That is an accurate summary of the situation, Calder said carefully. And whatever else is between us, Gwyneth said, is a separate matter from the political structure, not contingent on it. Correct, Calder said. He was very still. Gwyneth looked at him across the low fire. At this man who had ridden north into the ice because he had read about a woman crossing the peaks and wanted to meet her, who had saved his compliments for when they'd be worth something, who had sat with his hand on her stomach in the cold receiving room and told her the subject of children was closed. I'm not going to fall into something, she said, the way I did before. I'm going into things with both eyes open from now on. That seems wise, Calder said. I'd prefer it that way. Which means I'm going slowly. As slowly as you need. Which means, Gwyneth said, that what I'm telling you right now is not a resolution. It's a beginning. And I want you to know that I'm aware of what it is. Calder looked at her for a long moment. The firelight moved over his face, and he was not performing anything. Just present, as he always was, with that quality of complete attention that had been the first thing about him she had truly trusted. Gwyneth, he said. Yes. I have been entirely willing, since approximately the first evening I sat in Myra's great hall, and watched you assess my proposal with the focused critical engagement of someone who had spent months training to think strategically in the worst possible circumstances. He paused. To wait as long as you need. That was another saved compliment. I have several left. She laughed. That same surprised, bright, unguarded laugh that she was still getting used to having. Save them, she said. For when they're needed. I will, he said. She rode back to Frostholm a week later. The gate was open, as it always was, and Mira was in the yard when she rode in, supervising the construction of a new section of the south wall with the focused attention of someone who was going to live in this wall and has opinions about it. She looked up when Gwyneth dismounted, and her expression said everything she was not going to say out loud. Wren, Gwyneth asked immediately. Inside. Sleeping. She had a very busy morning, apparently involving an extended dispute with a kitchen cat. Who won? The cat retreated in good order, so I believe that's a draw. Mira studied her. You look different. Better or worse? More like yourself. Mira returned her attention to the wall. There's food. Go eat. Calder sent a messenger ahead with the council documents. I've read them. The Varick Treaty terms are good. I helped negotiate them. I know, Mira said without turning around. That's why they're good. Gwyneth smiled and went inside. Wren was in the small nursery room off the main hall, asleep on her stomach with her face pressed into the blanket and both small fists clenched beside her head, the attitude of someone who had succumbed to sleep under protest and was going to have words about it upon waking. The kitchen cat, a large orange beast of considerable dignity, was sitting at the edge of the cradle regarding her with the expression of someone who had, in fact, retreated in good order and did not consider the matter settled. Gwyneth sat in the chair beside the cradle. She watched her daughter sleep. She thought about what she had done and what she was building and the road back south and Calder's face in the firelight and her grandmother's wall and Arabella standing in the east garden with her hands pressed white against each other. She was not finished. She understood that clearly. There was more to build and more to navigate, and the comfortable, settled feeling of completion was not something her life was going to offer for a while, possibly ever. Frostholm was not finished. The Joint Council was new and would need tending. Calder's northeastern territory was solid but young. The treaty framework they had built needed seasons of practice to become real. And whatever was between her and Calder was, as she had said, a beginning, not a resolution. But beginnings were not nothing. They were, in fact, everything. The moment when you look clearly at what is in front of you and choose it, with both eyes open. Wren stirred. The small fists unclenched. She turned her face to the side and blinked, the slow emergence of someone returning from very deep unconsciousness, and then focused on Gwyneth with the specific expression she had been deploying since birth. The serious, searching look that seemed to be assessing whether you were worth the effort of consciousness. She apparently decided yes. Hello, Gwyneth said. Wren made a sound of elaborate displeasure and held up both arms. Gwyneth lifted her. The baby settled against her chest, immediately grabbing a fistful of her collar, and looked around the room with the proprietary gaze of a small person who has decided that this is her world and everyone in it is here for her benefit. The kitchen cat, apparently willing to make a strategic alliance against the common condition of being awake, jumped down from the cradle's edge and curled against Gwyneth's feet. 3 weeks later, Calder arrived at Frostholm with papers requiring Myra's countersignature on the treaty amendments. He stayed for dinner. He stayed for the evening. He stayed eventually because it was late and the northern road was dark. In the morning he was in the great hall working on council correspondence when Wren, brought in by her minder at the unreason Wren considered appropriate for the world to begin its day, spotted him across the room and made a commanding sound. Calder looked up from his papers. Wren regarded him with her assessing stare. Gwyneth watched from the doorway. Calder pushed back from the table and sat on the floor, cross-legged, at approximately Wren's eye level, in the no-ceremony, unembarrassed way of someone who did not find this beneath his dignity. He looked at Wren with the same gravity she was deploying at him. Wren crossed the floor on her unsteady legs with considerable determination and grabbed his collar. Calder settled her against his side without making a production of it. She stood leaning against him, one hand in his collar, looking around the room now from the superior vantage of being slightly taller. He returned to his papers. She watched what he was doing with the fixed, frowning attention of someone building a theory. Gwyneth stood in the doorway a little longer than she needed to. Then she went and got herself tea and came and sat at the table, and the three of them stayed there in the morning light, quietly occupying the same space, which was its own kind of language. A language Gwyneth was beginning to recognize as the most honest kind. Later that afternoon, when Mira had the papers and Wren was back with her minder and the practical portions of the day had been handled, Gwyneth found Calder in the small receiving room. He was standing at the window looking out at the ice fields, the low autumn sun laying long gold lines across the snow. She came and stood beside him. After a moment he turned and looked at her, and his expression was the open, unguarded one, the one that was his version of saying everything. She thought about what she had said by the fire in Winterbourne, going slowly, both eyes open. A beginning. She thought about the morning and Wren standing against his side, and the particular easy rightness of it. One of those saved compliments, she said. He blinked. Then, now. Yes. One. A pause. the deliberateness of him considering, choosing. "You have," he said, "the most extraordinary mind I have ever encountered, and it is made more extraordinary by the fact that it came out of circumstances that would have closed most minds, and it is made extraordinary beyond that by the fact that you are still choosing to use it generously, on behalf of people and places, not just on behalf of your own survival." He looked at her directly. "I am consistently in awe of you. I thought you should know that clearly." Gwyneth held his gaze. "That was more than one compliment," she said. "I counted it as one. That's a questionable accounting system. I'm prepared to defend it." She took his hand. Just took it quiet and deliberate, the way she was doing everything now, with full knowledge of what she was doing and why. He held it. Outside, the ice stretched toward the horizon, the last gold light of the afternoon catching in it and fracturing into something that looked, if you were willing to see it, something like a beginning. Something like two territories separately strong and equal, and everything between them still to be determined. Something that was not an ending. Something that was, properly, a start. Wren, brought outside by her minder for the late afternoon air, saw them standing at the window from the courtyard below. She apparently found the situation acceptable, because she turned her attention immediately back to the kitchen cat, who had followed her out and was once again being assessed with the focused strategic interest of someone who intends to resolve the earlier dispute decisively this time. Mira, watching from across the courtyard, noted all of this with quiet satisfaction and said nothing to anyone, because the story was telling itself, and it had, she thought, turned out very well. Did you enjoy the story? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment.